I'm on my way to go off-roading, and I didn't have enough time to get into the studio to shoot a video, so I'm multitasking. I'm going to shoot this video while we drive. Now, some people asked me recently about how I became an anarchist, and that's something that I don't talk about too often, but I guess philosophically I fall into the camp of an anarcho-capitalist, although capitalist seems to have a bad association to it right now. So I wanted to share my journey on how I became aligned with that philosophy and what arguments were made to me that made me fall into that camp. And I'll start off with the idea of anarchy versus monarchy. So anarchy is simply the idea of no ruler. So nobody's telling you what to do with your life. And just by that, a lot of people might go, oh, that might mean I'm an anarchist. But we all like rulers in some level, in some degree. So for example, if you have a day job, you might not only be in a controlled situation, you might be in a tyrannical situation because the boss makes the rules and you've got to accept whatever those rules are. And but other people want something called monarchy, which is just a minimized government, less rule around them. So the first argument that really got me down this path was one made by Tim Jennison. Tim Jennison's argument was, what would you do if you had a gun to enforce the rules that you needed to enforce? That's the basic premise of it. And it is based off the idea that the only thing that makes a government unique from any other corporation is their ability to use force on their customers. They need to collect taxes. They can take out a gun and come to your house and make you pay those taxes or lock you up, or they have the right to use force. While if Microsoft wants you to pay a bill, they can't come to your house with a gun. So the only real difference between a government and a corporation is their right to use force. And so the argument of what would you do if you had the exclusive right to use force, where is it appropriate and where is it not appropriate, looks something like this. Would you use a gun to defend yourself from being murdered? And most people will say, yes, of course I would. And then you might say, well, would you use a gun to defend your personal property? And people say, well, yeah, probably. And then they ask, well, would you use a gun to build a road, to get people to donate money to build a road? And the answer from almost everybody is, of course not. I'm not going to go to somebody's house and take their money with force. So this led me down the rabbit hole of, if it's unethical for me to use a gun to build a library, to build a road, to build a school, then the only purpose that a government should have from an ethical standpoint is ultimately just to do the things that are terrible, to fight wars, to handle all the bad incidents in life. That's the moral area for somebody who is using force for their customers. So that got me down to the monarchy idea of, okay, so maybe I don't need a government to build a school. We have private schools, or a road. We have private roads. All these things exist in private institutions, and I started looking at them and realizing that, well, private roads are more efficient, more cost-effective, and more sustainable than our public roads are. Private schools dramatically outperform our public schools, and the list goes on and on and on. You get to the point where you're like, well, there's nothing that a government seems to do that is better than what the private sector does. So that leads me down to this monarchy situation, where now I'm left with, what are the situations where it's justifiable to use a gun? And most people get to the point where they say it's good for courts, it's good for policing, and a government is useful when it comes to national defense. So now you got to start taking those apart. Now the government is only useful for three remaining things, and one of which I felt fell apart really quickly, which is that of courts. There are places where you can go where people will arbitrate within a private organization rather than having to go to a court. So a court was a pretty easy thing to get rid of. What about national defense? Well, for a lot of people, we pool our money together. So I don't live in a gated community, but I know a lot of people that do. And all they're really doing is they're setting themselves up to have a national defense, or a defense of their local territory. So they've collected their money and they've said, this is what we want to do on a voluntary basis rather than on a forced basis. So now I don't need to argue about national defense side of it. We all become responsible for building up our own defenses. We have to take personal responsibility, which is ultimately the other side of the coin when it comes to freedom, is that you've got to take responsibility. A lot of people don't care about freedom They care about having as little responsibility as possible in their life. They want other people to solve their problems. So they're never in favor of freedom, they're in favor of other people forcing it upon them. Anyways, we're back down to the last of those three things: courts, national defense, and then policing. And policing is one of the harder ones to get around, because we use police in so many different ways. And a lot of people are now saying, hey, defund the police, we hate the police. But when it really comes down to it, when we feel like we're in danger, we want to be able to call somebody to help us out. And again, I look to the private sector. So I live in Las Vegas, where every casino here has its own private security force. I could claim they're basically a private policing force. What they can do is they'll go in and take care of a problem. If there's a domestic dispute, if there's violence, if there's theft, they're on the scene and they respond significantly faster than any police officer does. In fact, if you run into a situation where you're being robbed or mugged, it's almost no likelihood that a cop is going to be there in time to take care of the situation. They're going to file a report and probably stash it away somewhere. While private police actually do a wonderful job of being there on time and quickly, because if they're bad at their job, you stop hiring them or you hire their competition instead. Another good example of this would be Disneyland. Disneyland has basically their own security force, and their incentives are very, very different. While police have basically no incentive for there to be no violence. Their incentive is they need to collect tax money so they can justify, their wages. And if crime doesn't exist, then their jobs don't exist. Well, at Disneyland, the police force, the security force, you could say, they're incentivized to make sure that incidences don't get out of control, that the experience for everybody isn't ruined. And so they don't shoot first. They, if anything, try and de-escalate situations whenever possible. And that is one of the massive advantages of a privatized police force. Now, some people will say, well, you're going to need somebody to do this. And that means that a privatized police force is going to ultimately be the new government, because they're the ones with force. And the difference is the fact that they don't have a monopoly. Right now, the government has a monopoly on police. They can come in and say, well, if anybody fights us against us, we're bringing in the weight of the SWAT teams and all of these organizations. Well, a privatized security force, well, if they don't do a good job, another privatized security force can come up and take care of that situation. Now, there gets into further complication when you get into jails. And what do you do when somebody does murder somebody if you don't have a government to lock them up and a court system to enforce that and all of that? And I'm happy to get into that if you want to learn more about it. But for now, I just wanted to share with you the basic fundamental path that I took, going from really I would say I was very, very liberal to I'm not at all conservative at this point. The only thing that's liberal about me at this point is the fact that the change I want to see involves reducing all of the government, all of the overhead, all of the tyranny that we currently deal with from our existing government. So that's how my political views change. This channel is not really a political channel, but if you're talking about getting into a state of the most freedom possible, then you should think about what kind of system would be the freest. And for me, that's a system of anarchy. And keep in mind that we all live most of our lives in a state of anarchy. Most of the interactions you have with other people don't require the state to get involved, to tell you what you can do or can't do, or what you can say or can't say. We don't require that level of policing. We just interact with each other because we assume positive intent in everybody else around us. And I think the world would be a much better place if, one, we took responsibility for our actions so that we could have that level of freedom, and two, assumed positive intent in those around us. If you're enjoying this content, please subscribe to my channel. I would really appreciate it, and I hope to see you on the next video.